Picture a church in Pittsburgh on the 27th of April, 1903. The pews are packed shoulder to shoulder. The street outside is packed tighter still. Thousands of people have come to stand in the raw spring cold because a coal and railroad heiress is about to become a countess. And America in that year still cannot get enough of watching its own daughters buy their way into the British peerage. The organ is warmed and ready. The flowers are banked so high they brush the rafters. Reporters from 3 cities have their notebooks open. The bride is inside a side chamber, 23 years old, dressed, veiled, gloved, and waiting. And she waits, and she keeps on waiting. 10 minutes pass. Then 30, then an hour, then longer, because the groom, an English earl named George Seymour, is not standing at the altar where a groom is supposed to stand. He is in another room down the corridor with a pack of lawyers, and he is refusing to walk down that aisle until the bride's mother agrees to put more money on the table. Not next week, not after the honeymoon, now. On the very morning of the wedding, with 3,000 people crushed onto the sidewalk, it's outside, and the guests already sweating in the pews, the Earl of Yarmouth is holding his own marriage hostage for cash. And the girl in the veil does not yet know the worst thing. She does not know that even after the money is signed over, even after she becomes his countess in front of that adoring crowd, this man will never once touch her. Not on the wedding night, not on any night that follows it. For 5 years, subscribe to the Gilded Cage and tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read every single one. And I want you here for this, because what this woman finally did at the end of those 5 hollow years shocked Edwardian society far more than the wedding day ransom ever did, and the way she did it broke one of the oldest unwritten rules her entire class was built to protect. Her name was Alice Cornelia Thaw, and to understand how she ended up veiled and abandoned in a side room of a Pittsburgh church, you have to understand first what her father had built out of the ground of Pennsylvania. William Thaw was not merely a rich man, he was one of the 100 wealthiest human beings in America, a titan, who had turned the Pennsylvania Company and the great railroads and the black coal buried under the hills into a fortune so vast it was already being measured in the tens of millions before the 20th century had properly begun. He was the kind of man whose name attached itself to institutions, whose money moved observatories and universities. And when he died in 1889, while Alice was still a child, she inherited coal lands valued at something close to $13 million, and on top of that a 1/16th share of the wider estate. Sit with that number for a moment, because the skill of understanding these people is the skill of understanding what the numbers actually meant. $13 million in 1889 maps to well north of $400 million in today's money, and that was one child's individual slice, carved off before the rest of the estate was even divided. Her mother, Mary Sibbett Copley Thaw, controlled a separate fortune that ran to something like $10 million by 1903, which is roughly 1/3 of $1 billion in modern terms, held and directed by a woman in an age when women were supposed to hold nothing at all. Now set that against the other end of the same city in the same year. A man working the mills and the yards that fed the Thaw fortune, breathing the coal dust that the family sold, took home somewhere in the region of $400 to $500 for an entire year of brutal labor. That is the arithmetic of the Gilded Age laid bare. It would have taken that laborer more than 25,000 years of unbroken work to earn what Alice inherited as a little girl. The distance between those 2 lives is not a detail in this story. It is the whole engine of it. Alice was born standing at the very top of that impossible tower, and she never once in her childhood had to look down and understand how far the drop was. That was her fortune. Now understand her weakness, because it was not greed, and it was not vanity, and it was not stupidity. Alice was, by every surviving account, a gentle and sheltered young woman, kind, modest, raised inside the suffocating certainties of her class. Her weakness was the specific hunger of her decade, a hunger that had been trained into her since birth. This was the golden age of the dollar princesses, the American heiresses whose new-minted industrial money bought them the single thing that money supposedly could never manufacture, which was ancient and titled blood. Consuelo Vanderbilt had been marched to the altar to marry the Duke of Marlborough only 8 years earlier, and the accounts say she wept behind her veil while her iron-willed mother sat guard to make sure she went through with it. Jenny Jerome had crossed the ocean to become Lady Randolph Churchill and mother to a future Prime Minister. The trade was understood and openly discussed on both sides of the Atlantic, in the drawing rooms and in the newspapers alike. The logic of it was brutal and simple. British titles in that era were land rich and cash poor, bleeding slowly to death under the crushing cost of estates and great houses they could no longer afford to heat, roof, or staff. American industrial families were the opposite, cash-rich and title-poor, drowning in new money and starving for the one ornament that no factory in Pittsburgh could ever stamp out, the social validation of an ancient name, so the daughters became the medium of exchange. They were the coin in which the deal was settled, and Alice Thaw, gentle and obedient and raised to believe that a brilliant marriage was the highest achievement a woman of her station could reach for, walked straight into that marketplace fully believing that she and her family were the buyers. She never understood until it was far too late that she was the thing being bought. Nobody had told her. Nobody in that world ever told the girls. Now, let me introduce you properly to the man waiting in that side corridor with his lawyers, because George Francis Alexander Seymour was one of the strangest fortune hunters the entire Gilded Age ever produced, and I do not use that word lightly. He was born in Knightsbridge, London, in October of 1871, an heir standing in line to a very great inheritance. In time he would become the 7th Marquess of Hertford and the master of Ragley Hall, one of the truly grand houses of Warwickshire, a Palladian pile set in acres of parkland with a history stretching back centuries. That was his future, waiting for him at the far end of an uncle's life. The present, at the moment he met Alice Thaw, was a great deal shabbier and more desperate than the future promised. George had no money that stayed money. What George had instead of a fortune was a peculiar and revealing dream. He wanted more than anything to be a performer on the stage. And here is the detail that lifts this story out of the ordinary run of broke aristocrat tales and turns it into something far darker and far more human. In the middle years of the 1890s, years before he ever set foot in Pittsburgh, George Seymour had travelled all the way to Australia and performed there as a skirt dancer under the stage name Mademoiselle Rose. Read that again and let it settle. An English lord, heir to a marquessate, put on a costume built with glittering sequins and great butterfly wings and imitated the famous serpentine dances of Loie Fuller, swirling vast lengths of silk under the coloured theatre lights in front of Australian audiences, who had not the faintest idea that the shimmering woman-shaped figure moving on the stage before them was an English aristocrat in elaborate disguise. Later he carried the same ambition to the United States, performing there under yet another invented name, Eric Hope, attaching himself to the theatrical company of the famous impresario Charles Frohman. He spent something close to 3 full years chasing a legitimate career on the legitimate stage, and when the legitimate stage would not take him seriously, he began to slide sideways and downward toward vaudeville. Hold on to that butterfly costume. Hold on to the sequins and the silk and the false woman's name and the image of a man performing a woman for an audience that swallowed the illusion whole. That costume is the single truest object in this entire story, and it explains almost everything that was about to happen to Alice, because George Seymour's whole existence was a performance of a man he was not. He was 32 years old when he married her, and he had spent his adult life learning, on stage after stage, exactly how to make a watching crowd believe in something that did not exist. George Seymour was homosexual. And in the England of that precise moment, this was not a private matter of the heart. It was a matter of survival. The Labouchere Amendment had sent Oscar Wilde to Reading Gaol for 2 years of hard labor only a few years before, in a trial that had transfixed and terrified every man in Britain who shared Wilde's nature. A man in George's position could be ruined, imprisoned, driven into exile or suicide for who he was and who he loved. His options were narrow and cruel, almost beyond modern comprehension. He could live a hidden and honest life and starve slowly on a bankrupt inheritance he could not touch until his uncle died, or he could do the thing that men in his exact position had been doing quietly for centuries. He could marry a great deal of money, perform the role of devoted husband, exactly the way he had once performed Mademoiselle Rose under the Australian lights, and let a rich woman's fortune quietly underwrite the ancient estate he had been born to inherit. Alice Thaw to George Seymour was never a bride and never a person. She was a booking. She was, in the cold, theatrical arithmetic of his life, the longest and most lucrative run of his entire career. So the plan set itself steadily into motion. And if you have ever in your own life watched someone talk themselves into a decision that every quiet instinct is screaming against, stay close to this part, because Alice's own family very nearly saw the whole thing in time and chose deliberately to look away. Subscribe if you have not yet, because what her family knew and what they decided to bury under the weight of a coronet is the part of this story that still makes my skin crawl a full century later. The engagement was formally announced in February of 1903, and almost from the moment the announcement went out, the warnings began to arrive from every direction. There were persistent whispers about George's debts, which were entirely real and genuinely enormous. There were pointed questions in society about why a man of George's known tastes and reputation had pursued an American heiress quite so hard and quite so fast. Alice's mother, Mary, was nobody's fool. She was a formidable, sharp, deeply capable woman who would later spend a fortune and years of her life trying to save her other child from the electric chair. She had the resources to investigate this English earl right down to the debts on his tailor's account. And the machinery of the family did exactly what the machinery of these great families always did when it stood at this fork in the road. It weighed the private scandal and public embarrassment of a broken engagement against the glittering social prize of a genuine British coronet, a real title for a Pittsburgh girl. And after doing that cold sum, it decided that the coronet was worth the risk. The wedding stayed on the calendar. The warnings were folded up and put away. The invitations went out. Everyone who mattered chose, in unison, not to know the thing they half knew, which brings us back to the church and the side corridor and the 3 long hours of waiting. This is the exact moment where the mask slipped in full public view and every single person present chose not to see it. While Alice stood in her veil, growing colder and more frightened by the minute, George and his lawyers sat in another room and renegotiated the entire marriage settlement in real time, using the fully assembled and waiting wedding as their leverage. The reporting from the period is blunt and unsparing about what happened. He extorted her mother and her family to increase the size of the dowry under the open and undisguised threat that he would simply not go through with the ceremony at all. Consider the precise, surgical cruelty of the timing. Not a week beforehand in a lawyer's quiet office, not on the night before in a private word. The morning of with the guests already seated and the enormous crowd already choking the street outside, and Alice's public humiliation absolutely guaranteed if he chose to walk away. He had spent months building the perfect trap, and he sprang it at the one and only moment when it could not possibly fail, because the shame of a jilting on that scale would have fallen entirely on the bride and never on the groom. And it worked exactly as he had calculated it would. The settlement was adjusted upward, the money was found and promised, and only then did the Earl of Yarmouth finally emerge and take his place at the altar. Alice, 23 years old, radiant in a gown that had cost a labourer's lifetime of wages, already betrayed and ransomed before she had even reached the man's side, married him in front of a packed and cheering house that saw a fairy tale unfolding, and could not see, the ransom that had just been quietly paid in the room down the hall. The unravelling the illusion of success, the golden picture of the American heiress and her English earl, lasted just about as long as it took the two of them to cross the Atlantic Ocean. On paper, and only on paper, Alice was now a triumph. She was the Countess of Yarmouth. She had the title her mother's money had purchased. She had a husband, a future marquessate, waiting in the wings, and the ancient estates of one of England's oldest families arranged like a promise around her new name. Photographs were taken and distributed to a hungry press. The Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Warwickshire still holds archive material today on the marriage of the Earl of Yarmouth and Alice Cornelia Thaw, dated the early days of May 1903, a careful paper record of a union that the paper could describe with far more warmth and conviction than the two people trapped inside it could ever manage to live, because behind the title, behind the photographs, in the private rooms where no reporter and no camera ever followed, the marriage was a single locked door that never once opened. They lived together, on and off, at Ragley and at Park Hall in Salford Priors, and at whatever fashionable address the ongoing performance happened to require them to be seen occupying. And the entire time, month after month and year after year, George Seymour treated his young wife with what the historical record describes in plain and unsparing language as physical repulsion. He would not consummate the marriage. He would not touch her. He could not bring himself to, and beyond the physical impossibility, for a man of his nature, there is in the record something colder still, a distaste, a recoiling. Whatever tenderness Alice had been raised from the cradle to expect from marriage, whatever a sheltered and modest girl of her exact era understood a wedding night, and the years after it was supposed to contain, none of it ever came. Not once. She was a wife who was not a wife, kept in a beautiful and ancient house like one more piece of the fine furniture that her own dowry had helped to pay for. And here, buried at the very center of this gilded fortress, is the loose thread that would eventually pull the whole construction apart. In an age that offered a married woman almost no reliable privacy, no independent income of her own, and a crushing legal doctrine called coverture that folded a wife's entire legal identity and most of her property into her husband's person, the very instant she spoke her vows, the one single thing that Alice's marriage completely lacked was the one thing that could, in the end, destroy it. It had never been real, and a marriage that had never been made physically real was, under the strict law of that time, a marriage with a deep structural crack running straight through the foundation of it, a flaw that a determined woman, if she were brave enough and rich enough and willing enough to endure the exposure, could one day drive a legal wedge into. Now bring in the hunters, because in this particular story the hunters were not detectives, and they were not tabloid journalists, and they were not vengeful rivals. The hunters were lawyers, and the astonishing thing, the thing that reframes this entire narrative and lifts Alice out of the long grey line of passive dollar princess victims, is who unleashed them. Alice did. This is the pivot on which the whole story turns. So let me be as precise as I can about how strange and how dangerous it was for a woman in her position. A woman in Alice's exact situation was expected, above all else, to endure. That was the design. That was the entire social contract. You took the title, and you took the private humiliation that came bundled with it, and you kept your composure and your silence until the day you died, because a divorce or an annulment in that world was a public detonation that shamed the woman infinitely more than it shamed the man. Consuelo Vanderbilt endured her own hollow marriage for the better part of a decade before it formally came apart. The whole machine ran on the fuel of female silence, and Alice Thaw looked directly at that contract, at the man who had ransomed her at the altar, and then refused her ever after, at the beautiful empty life stretching out in front of her, and she tore the contract in half. She went to the law, and she did not go quietly. And she did not go by the discreet side door. She sued for annulment on the single most exposing legal ground that was available to any woman in the year 1908, non-consummation. She chose the one path out that required her to say the unsayable thing out loud, in a courtroom for the record, in front of the world, understand exactly what that legal ground demanded of a woman like Alice, because the courage of it is easy to miss from a modern distance. To win an annulment on the ground of non-consummations, Alice could not simply stand up and testify that the marriage had been unhappy, or cold, or loveless. Unhappiness was not grounds for anything. She had to prove in the unblinking eyes of the court, and therefore in the eyes of the entire watching world, that she remained a virgin, that her husband had never once touched her in 5 years of marriage. Her own body became the central evidence in the case. Her most private and intimate physical circumstance became a matter of formal legal record, examined and certified by physicians, and entered into the court file for lawyers and clerks, and eventually reporters to read. For a woman raised inside the near-total modesty of her class and her time, this was a form of deliberate self-exposure that we can barely imagine now. She had to walk into the harsh light of the public square and announce, in effect, and then in fact, that after 5 years as a married countess, she had never been made a wife at all. The panic in this story never once belonged to Alice. The panic belonged to every single person around her who understood, with rising horror, that she was about to say out loud the exact thing their entire world had been engineered to keep forever unsaid. The exposure, when it finally came, was total and it was merciless. And the newspapers of the era treated the wreckage of the marriage exactly as you would expect a hungry press to treat it. On both sides of the Atlantic, the papers fell on the story of the marriage that had never truly been a marriage. Here was an American dollar princess, one of the richest and most watched young women in the entire world, standing up in open court to declare that her English earl had extorted her family at the very altar, and had then refused to so much as touch her for 5 long years. It had every single ingredient the papers of that age could dream of: vast money, an ancient foreign title, a villain with an aristocratic accent, and a marriage bed that had stayed cold and empty behind a golden door. The story of the wedding day ransom, which had once been only a rumor traded in drawing rooms, now had sworn courtroom testimony standing behind it. And the story of the annulment itself, with its clinical, humiliating, and entirely public grounds, gave the tabloids something they could return to and pick over again and again across weeks of coverage. And I want you to ask yourself, as the press of 2 nations tore into the ruins of this marriage, who was actually being punished in all of it? Because if you are the kind of person who is drawn to the stories of the one's history, dragged into the dock of public opinion, when the true fault lay somewhere else entirely, then subscribe and stay with me, because what the courts and the establishment decided to do next is the part almost nobody remembers. It would have been very easy, and some corners of the press did exactly this, for the world to cast Alice as the fool of the piece, the naive rich girl who had bought herself a dud of a husband, and then could not even manage to keep him in her bed. That was one available story, and it was a cruel one, and it put the shame back where that society always preferred to put it, on the woman. But something harder and truer sat underneath those easy headlines, and it is the thing that makes Alice worth remembering. Alice had not merely been fooled by a clever con man. She had been used as collateral, spent like a chip by two families who had both seen the warning signs in advance and had both coldly decided that a coronet was worth a daughter's 5 wasted years. The Earl was without question the con artist at the center of it. But the machinery that had delivered Alice to him, veiled and shivering and waiting in that side room, had been built and operated by her own class and her own blood. And it had done this exact thing to other women before her, and would go on doing it to others after her. To make Alice the fool was to let that machinery off the hook entirely. The high society response to the scandal was swift, and it was entirely self-protective, in exactly the way these things always were among people who understood that reputation was the only currency that could not be replaced. A homosexual earl who had bankrupted himself, extorted an American family in a church vestry, and then been dragged in humiliating public detail through an annulment court on the ground of non-consummation, was simply not a man that the British peerage wished to defend too loudly or stand too close to. George Seymour's entire financial life was already visibly collapsing beneath him. He filed for bankruptcy in 1909, and then again in 1910, the 2 years bracketing the formal end of the marriage, a broke aristocrat whose one great scheme, the American heiress, had come apart in the worst and most public way imaginable. And so the establishment did precisely what establishments do at such moments. It let the annulment proceed with a minimum of fuss. It let the American girl take her money and her maiden name and go home across the ocean. And it quietly, collectively closed ranks around the comfortable idea that the whole miserable affair had been nothing more than an unfortunate transatlantic misunderstanding, a match that simply had not taken, rather than what it actually was, which was a gentle and trusting woman auctioned by her own family into the keeping of a man who was constitutionally and permanently incapable of ever wanting her, and the trial, such as it was, went entirely Alice's way in the end. The annulment was formally granted in 1908. The court accepted and recorded the ground of non-consummation. The marriage that had been sealed with such enormous public ceremony in front of 3,000 cheering onlookers was legally declared, by the cold machinery of the law, to have never truly existed at all. In one sense, it was a genuinely stunning victory, and it should be named as one. A woman had walked directly into the machinery that had been designed from the ground up to grind her into permanent silence, and she had walked back out again with her freedom intact, and just as crucially, with her enormous fortune restored to her own hands. Because that is the other verdict in this story, the financial one, and it matters every bit as much as the legal one that made the headlines. The verdict and the viered when the marriage was formally dissolved, every one of Alice's financial interests was returned to her. Every dollar the Earl had extorted in that side room off the church corridor, every clause of settlement he had wrung out of her frightened mother under the threat of a public jilting, came back into her own control. This was very far from a small or automatic thing, and it is easy to underrate it from where we stand now. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman's property had for centuries flowed to her husband upon marriage, and very often stayed firmly with him even when a union collapsed, leaving discarded wives dependent on the goodwill of the men who had discarded them. Alice got hers back, clean and entire. She resumed her maiden name. She was Miss Alice Thaw once more, no longer anyone's countess, and she gathered herself and took herself away to Lenox, Massachusetts, into the quieter and older world of established New England money. And there she began the long, slow work of becoming a person again rather than a transaction that had gone wrong, So where, then, did the stolen years actually go? And what in the final accounting did they truly cost her? The money, as we have seen, was recovered in full. The years were not, and never could be. Alice had married at 23 and had climbed out of the wreckage at 28, half a decade of her youth and her beauty, and her hope spent as the purely ornamental wife of a man who found her physically unbearable to be near. There is no court in the world and no ledger ever written that returns those 5 years to a woman. And beneath the missing years there is the quieter and more intimate damage that the historical record only gestures at, the private toll of having stood in a courtroom and offered up the single most intimate fact of your own body as sworn legal proof, of having read about the coldness of your own empty marriage bed in the morning papers over breakfast, of knowing that the entire watching world now saw you and would go on seeing you as the woman that no earl would touch. Whatever composure Alice managed to keep through all of it, and by every surviving account she kept a very great deal of it, the cost of that composure was paid out in a currency that even her vast fortune could not cover or replace. The collateral damage in this story spread outward from Alice in a way that makes her own private suffering feel somehow both smaller and larger at the same time, because you must remember who her brother was. While Alice's marriage was slowly curdling into nothing across the ocean in England, her brother, Harry Kendall Thaw, was busy living out a scandal that would come to eclipse hers entirely and would burn its way into American history in a way Alice's quiet tragedy never did. Harry had married the celebrated chorus girl and artist's model Evelyn Nesbit, and in June of 1906, on the rooftop theater of Madison Square Garden in New York, in front of a crowd of diners and performers, Harry Thaw walked up to the famous and celebrated architect Stanford White and shot him 3 times in the face, killing him over White's earlier relationship with Nesbit when she had been very young. The trial that followed was breathlessly called the trial of the century. And the Thaw fortune, the very same coal and railroad money that had bought Alice her hollow coronet, was now spent by the millions to keep Harry out of the electric chair, to buy the finest lawyers in the country, and eventually to have him declared not guilty by reason of insanity rather than hanged or electrocuted. So consider the true shape of this one family seen whole. One child's inherited fortune purchased a British title from a man who despised the woman attached to it. The other child's inherited fortune purchased an insanity verdict and an escape from execution after a cold-blooded public murder. The same coal money that could buy an English earl could also buy a way around a death sentence. What that money could not buy, for either of those 2 children in the end, was a life that actually worked. Alice's private ruin and Harry's public one were struck from the very same mint, but Alice's forced exile from her old titled identity turned out, against every expectation, to be a kind of rescue. In March of 1913, 5 years after the annulment had set her free, she married again, and this time she chose in an entirely different direction. Her second husband was Geoffrey George Whitney, an American stockbroker, no title, no coronet. No ancient bleeding estate, no butterfly costume hidden in the past. Just a man. They were married at Plum Orchard, her sister's home on Cumberland Island off the coast of Georgia, a world and an ocean away from the packed Pittsburgh church and the shouting crowd in the street. This second marriage was real in every way the first had been a performance. It produced 2 sons. It lasted the rest of her life. The dollar princess who had been ransomed and abandoned at the altar found, on the far side of scandal and courtrooms and public shame, the ordinary human thing that all the money in the world had failed to buy her the first time around. Step back now and look at what this small, strange, half-forgotten annulment actually meant, because it was a great deal larger than one broken marriage between 2 mismatched people. Alice Thaw's case sat inside a decades-long transatlantic phenomenon that quite literally reshaped the British aristocracy itself. The historians who study the dollar princess marriages of this era estimate that hundreds of American heiresses crossed the ocean to marry into the British peerage across roughly 2 generations, carrying with them a flood of new American industrial money that re-roofed the great houses of England, restored their crumbling estates, and kept the entire aristocratic class solvent well into the 20th century when it might otherwise have collapsed under its own weight. Alice was one soldier in that vast migration, one transaction among hundreds. But her case did something that most of the quieter, more successful ones never did. It said the quiet part out loud in a courtroom on the record. It dragged into open daylight the ugly truth that these marriages were transactions, that some of these charming titled husbands wanted the money and nothing else on earth beyond it, and that a coronet could be a cage every bit as much as it could be a crown. Every anxious heiress and every calculating mother who read about Alice Thaw's non-consummation suit over their morning coffee understood the warning that was folded up inside it. And what stands today where all of this unfolded? George Seymour got his marquessate at last in 1912, and with it came Ragley Hall, that vast and beautiful Warwickshire house, which still stands today and is still held by the Seymour family well over a century later, long after George himself died childless in Torquay in 1940, having never once remarried after Alice. The final performance of Mademoiselle Rose folded away and packed in a trunk for good. The great house survived him. The man who had very nearly gambled it away in his string of bankruptcies did not father the line that ultimately kept it. Alice's Pittsburgh, the roaring coal and steel colossus that had made the entire Thaw fortune, transformed and boomed and faded and remade itself as the heavy industries that built it slowly died away across the century. And the butterfly costume, the sequins, the great silk wings, the false woman's name spoken under the theatre lights of Australia, survives now only as a strange and glittering detail in the historical record, the single most honest artifact that this whole story left behind. A man who spent his entire life performing a self that he was not, and a gentlewoman who was married to the performance and mistook it for 5 long years for a marriage. So in the end, was justice actually served here? This is where I have to be honest with you, because the clean and satisfying answer is tempting and the true answer is more tangled and more human than the clean one. On the surface, yes, justice was done. Alice won. She got her freedom back, she got her fortune back. She got a real marriage and 2 real sons and a long life in the end. And George Seymour got bankruptcy, obscurity, and a childless death in a seaside town. If what you want is a story where the con artist loses and the wronged woman wins, this one very nearly hands it to you on a plate. But look a little closer, because the honest verdict resists the clean shape. George was not simply a cartoon villain. He was a homosexual man living in a society that had criminalized the very fact of his existence, a society that offered him a brutal binary of marriage or ruin, and then left him to choose. And he chose cravenly and cruelly to ruin an innocent woman rather than face the ruin of himself. Both of those things are true at the very same time. He was a predator upon Alice's fortune and her youth, and he was also a prisoner of the savage laws of his own century. And Alice, in her turn, was both a victim of a cruel and calculating man and a victim of her own family's cold arithmetic, delivered up to that altar by people who genuinely loved her and who calculated her market value in the very same breath. The real verdict, the one that holds up when you turn it over in the light, is that there were no clean villains standing in that Pittsburgh church at all. There was only a machine, vast and old and utterly indifferent, that turned living human beings into currency, and 2 young people who were fed into the gears of it and who both came out the other side badly damaged. One poorer in reputation and one poorer in the youth she would never get back. I want to leave you at the very end with the image of the church, because it is the truest picture of everything that followed. 3,000 people packed into the freezing street, a girl in a white veil waiting in a cold side room, while down the corridor the man she is about to marry counts her mother's money one final time before he will consent to appear and take her hand. She does not know yet that the door to her marriage will never open. Not that night and not any night. She only knows that she is waiting, and that everyone in the world is watching her wait, and that the waiting has somehow already become her fault. She stood there in that veil for 3 long hours, and then, in every way that truly mattered, she went on standing there for 5 long years, waiting for a marriage that was never going to come, until the single day she finally decided that she was done waiting and walked with her head up into a courtroom to say so out loud, to the judge, to the press, to the whole watching world. That is the thing I most want you to remember about Alice Thaw. Not that she was bought and paid for like a parcel of coal land, but that she refused, in the end, when every rule of her world told her to stay silent and endure, to stay sold. If this story moved you tonight, subscribe to the Gilded Cage so that the next one finds its way to you. Share it with someone who still believes, deep down, that money can buy a way out of anything at all, because Alice Thaw is the living proof of exactly how much money cannot buy, and exactly what it costs to learn that lesson. This is the Gilded Cage, where every title was a lock, and some of the finest locks were made of gold. Some cages were built and polished and decorated to look exactly like gifts. Alice was handed hers in a church, in a white veil, in front of the whole cheering world. It took her 3 hours to enter it, and 5 years to find the door back out, and when at last she found that door, she did the bravest thing a woman of her time and her class could possibly do. She opened it, and she walked out, and she never once looked back. She was one of the lucky ones. She found the way out. And some lullabies, the ones we tell about the gilded and the trapped, never truly end. This was hers.